Ladies and gentlemen, the clock is ticking. In the next 10 minutes, 180 families will have migrated to a city somewhere in the world. By the time we sit down for dinner, 26,000 of them will be hunting for a home. By the end of the month, 800,000 of them will be experiencing the realities of urban housing shortage. And by end of the year, 10 million additional households will be in need of affordable housing.
This is happening as we speak. The 21st century is very rightly described as the century of the cities. And if so, humanity needs to house the citizens of these cities affordably. Let's start by defining the terms. Affordability can be characterized in terms of the extent of financial burden for housing. This could be, say, 30 to 40% of income, and guidelines on minimum acceptable standards for a housing unit or for a community.
With this definition, conservative estimates from the McKinsey Global Institute, through profiling almost 2,400 cities, suggest that at least 330 million households today face affordability challenges. By 2025, an additional 110 million will be added to this mix, given urbanization patterns. Thus, approximately 440 million households, or 1.6 billion people, or at least 1/3 of all those living in cities, will face an affordability challenge in the coming decade.
Virtually no country is immune, and the clock is ticking. I must confess that I feel this urgency in a very personal way. I was born in the outskirts of a second-tier town, close to the tip of southern India. These were the days before any mortgage financing existed. But when I was 10, my parents saved up enough money to buy us a home. And I still vividly recall the day my parents held the key to the home in their hands. And it changed everything for us. It changed how we thought of ourselves. It changed our notion of self-esteem. It changed our social standing. It gave us courage, and it allowed us to take risks. Risks which led to upward mobility. Over the past few years, I've had the privilege to lead McKinsey's practice in housing, a journey that has taken me all the way from Kuala Lumpur to Lagos. And during this time, I've had the chance to observe firsthand what housing means to individuals. Housing is not just about shelter. Housing is not just about infrastructure. Housing was about identity. Housing was about identity. And those who have lived through the Arab Spring will relate to the notion, the power of identity when unleashed. I will come back to this notion of identity, but right now I'm conscious of that clock ticking. So I'd like to shift gears and explore with you 3 long-standing myths. 3 myths which underpin how we can reimagine housing delivery in the coming decade. Myth number 1, we have no land for affordable housing. Reality, we can unlock sufficient land where required through targeted land policies. Let's take this illustration of a fast-growing city from the Middle East of 6 million people. Median land cost as a share of the total developed cost of a unit was approaching 40 to 50% in the last 2 decades, making housing unaffordable for large segments of the society. So the city responds in a classic way with urban planning measures. It expands outwards with greenfield sites being brought forward for development. The challenge is that without social infrastructure and without transportation keeping up, there were no takers for many of these housing projects. Even when people relocated, many of them earned the stigma of being low-income ghettos. The interesting observation, though, is if you look at the city very closely, there are actually enough pockets of idle land, zoned residential idle land, that have been there for the past 2 decades but are not brought forward for development. This is many times driven by ownership patterns, speculation, land hoarding, or even formality of titles. The narrative that I just shared with you repeats itself again and again and again in many global cities. Land is available, but not an acre to build. So the question really is, what tools can we give ourselves to unlock land when required, where required? One example of a way to do so is the notion of idle land regulations, particularly focused on zoned residential land within our urban boundaries that's connected to infrastructure, but yet has remained idle for whatsoever reasons. An idle land system comprises a couple of things. There could be incentives provided for development, coupled with a financial burden on the land parcel. A financial burden that you can package as a penalty, a service charge for infrastructure, or even a land value tax. But what this does is gives the city the necessary tools to regulate the financial burden on the land, and hence focus on zones where the land supply is most required, where employment, housing, and infrastructure can converge, where mixed income communities can be created. What this also does is encourage responsible land ownership, particularly where the value of the land has benefited from the development around it. There are examples of idle land systems that are actively under debate and even under legislation, all the way from UK to the Middle East to Southeast Asia. A discussion on affordable housing delivery in the coming 10 years has to hinge on the notion of idle land systems to unlock land. This brings me to my second point. Even with land, myth number 2 is that housing is too expensive to deliver. Reality, we can deliver housing on time, at cost, at the right scale. With stagnant construction sector productivity and massive shortages of skilled labor around the world, we need to reimagine a world where housing is delivered in an industrial fashion, either from factories or on-site. And technology has to be a key enabler for this, from precast and prefab housing to system formworks, but essentially converting the notion of housing construction to housing production. It's also critical to organize the supply chain around this, and here the role of the government is critical, from enabling procurement of building materials at scale to new innovative building materials. If the infrastructure world can be inspired by the story of a 30-floor tower being constructed in 15 days, affordable housing can provide the blank canvas to scale up these systems around the world. The missing link, however, is to combine the technology which is already available with the right delivery model, the right model that encourages private sector participation at scale. Designing and de-risking the right PPP programs that bring in the private sector are going to be critical, and there are unfortunately far and few precedents in the real estate and housing sector for this. And this has to be done through well-structured quid pro quos. There have to be mandates and obligations for delivery of housing on either government land or private land, combined with the right incentives that are provided to the private sector. Incentives that address the risk of doing affordable housing. Incentives that address the bottom line, and incentives that can even provide an upside for doing affordable housing. There are examples of industrial systems that have been commercialized, all the way from Brazil to Mexico to Turkey, and we need to replicate many more such programs around the world. Even with land and delivery, the third question is around financing. Myth number 3, affordable housing is too risky. Reality, affordable housing is an acceptable credit risk when properly structured. Mortgage relative to the GDP is still in the single digits in many parts of the world. The response typically is to design vouchers and subsidy programs. And while these are necessary, they are untenable in the long term. Addressing and underwriting the risks of lending to low-income segments through well-structured financial products has to be at the core of the solution. Mortgage guarantee funds, secondary mortgage institutions, and liquidity facilities are increasingly been seen as the vehicles to do so, to enable financial inclusion. India and Nigeria, for instance, set up their flagship programs in their last 2 years. And we need to evaluate many more such ideas for financial inclusion all over the world. As powerful as these ideas are in themselves, the real question is how can we connect the dots between land, delivery, and financing? Integrated housing programs that can bring this package together are inherently powerful. The Mina Casa Mina Vida program from here in Brazil, or the TOKI program in Turkey, have attempted to do so. Mobilize upwards of 500,000 to 1 million homes in a decade with varying degrees of success. There's a lot that we can learn from them. The world needs 100 such programs in the coming decade. Hernando del Soto, the acclaimed Peruvian economist, perhaps had the last word on this. He said, with identity at scale comes inclusion. And with inclusion comes integration of these citizens into the mainstream. It gives them a real shot at upward mobility. When I reflect on what has shaped my identity, it is not my passport, it's not my calling card, but it's actually this. This is the key that we held to our first home when I was 10. I carry this as a talisman for the power of identity delivered through housing. The question I'd like to leave with you today is, how can we collectively unlock the keys to 1 billion identities through affordable housing in the coming decade? Thank you.